Linda, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to tell us about your son, Michael, and his treatment at the Birmingham Children's Hospital. So Michael was born in 1969, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And he was diagnosed with severe haemophilia A when he was about 3 years old?
No, two.
Two.
About two. Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, you know when they start to crawl, when they're little and everything, he was getting these bad bruises with lumps and things. Well, our GP, who I took him to see, he'd been a family doctor, and we've never known haemophilia in our family. So, you know, that isn't what he didn't suspect that. And he used to give him vitamin C and things like that. And he even asked me if I was knocking him about. He says, I've got to ask you this. And I said, well, good Lord, no. And anyway, he retired. And Michael would be about two. We had a new doctor, a young doctor. And we went through it. He had a swollen knee, I think it was. And I took him to the doctors. And he said, well, he just looked back at the records and he asked me questions. And he said, I want to send you straight up to the hospital. And he wrote a letter. And he said, I want you to take this to the hospital in Wolverhampton. So that's what I did. And I was just amazed because they said, we've got to keep him in. And he was just taken away and I had to go home. And it was like that in those days. They didn't let you hang about, you know. So I went home and I did nothing but weep, you know. I didn't know what was going on. Anyway, when I had to go back, they took me to one side and they said that he's got haemophilia. And I've got to be honest, I'd never heard of it before. So I don't know whether it missed a generation, because they say it can, I don't know. We've never, even to this day, found out. And yet we'd never heard of it before. But anyway, that's how we found out that he was haemophilia. He got haemophilia, and then I had him transferred from Wolverhampton to the Birmingham Children's, to the haemophilia department. And then we just had to keep going up every time he hurt himself in some way. We would have to go up the hospital. And when they're little, they're always falling or doing something, aren't they? So it was quite a journey every time, you know, but had to be done.
And initially, Michael was treated with cryoprecipitate.
Yes.
And then, I think at a time when he had NHS concentrate.
Yes, that's right.
But then, and your recollection was that it was perhaps the early 1980s, we can look at a document in a moment, but it was switched to US commercial concentrates,
yeah.
and it was the Armour concentrate, I think, that you mainly remembered.
Right, okay. I know it was I can't remember the name. Now you've said it, I recognise it, but...
Were you told anything, whether by Dr. Hill or anyone else at the Children's Hospital, about the risks associated with the factor concentrates?
With the American, no. Well, I went to the meeting that you mentioned earlier. To me, when they were on about this virus, I hadn't really heard of that before. So it was like, you know, taking it all in and knowing what was going on, really. And I knew it was a worry. They was talking as though they'd only just sort of found out. That's the way I felt at the time.
Before we get to that meeting, though, which was probably 1984, your son had been being treated during the 1970s and the early 1980s. So before that meeting, did anyone ever tell you that the concentrates might transmit hepatitis?
No, I was told by Sister Marion that they would be stopping the British one because it was a lack of supply. So she said, we're having it from America. And that's all she said. So you just accept that that's it, you see. So he was put on that treatment. And I can't remember how long it was from then to when we had the meeting.
We can look at a document which you've exhibited to your witness statement, and it was a document filled in, I think, at the time of the haemophilia litigation, and it's been filled in by a doctor by reference to Michael's records. Mm-hmm. So if we look at WITN 1616003, and if we go to the next page, it's described as preliminary medico-legal report on Michael Anthony Price. And then if we go to, we can see it refers to documents, letter of instruction, and then records from the hospitals, uncertified copies of batch numbers from the Children's Hospital. And then if we go down towards the bottom of the page, we can see there that the doctor who's filled this in had Michael's records, and then we can see the words haemophilia A severe, diagnosed at 3 years old, cryoprecipitate 1973 to 1997.
Yeah.
And then if we go to the next page, and we look at the bottom of the page, the very bottom, we've got there the date the client was first given factor VIII or 9 concentrate, 23rd of May 1977. And then if we go over the page, we can see it says under the paragraph B at the top, Armour 1977 to 83 and 1986, NHS 1978 to 86, including Scottish 1984, and then Alpha, which is a different commercial product, 1986 to 1987. Yeah. So it looks from this as though Michael was treated sometimes with an NHS product, but certainly also with the Armour product. And that's what you remember from the conversation with Sister Marion, that they were going to have to switch to that because they didn't have enough NHS.
Yeah, and that's all I was told, yeah.
And do you feel you were ever given a choice about what treatment Michael would receive?
Not at that point, no. She just said that's what was happening. So I just accepted it, you know.
And Michael, according to this document, was on home treatment from about 1977. Do you recall that?
Yes, yeah.
Prior to that, when he'd received cryoprecipitate in the hospital, had he had any difficulties with the cryoprecipitate?
No, none.
We can take that down, thank you. Can you then tell us what you remember about a meeting at the Birmingham Children's Hospital in 1984?
Yes, I can't remember too many details because it was such a lot to take in all evening, but they were just telling us that about this virus, which I'd never heard of before, I've got to be honest. They were showing you things on boards, you know, like diagrams and things of this virus, and you know, and it was a lot to take in. But I knew it sounded bad, but I didn't know exactly. I mean, it wasn't in the news either then. It came on the news after about it. It built up on, you know, the AIDS and that, and then it sinks in how really bad it is. But
if we look at your statement, I'll just read out what you say about it in your statement, Linda. So you say, I believe in or around 1984, a special meeting was held at the BCH. I attended this meeting without Michael, taking my sister with me. I recall it was Dr. Hill who ran the meeting in a big hall that was full of a mixture of doctors and parents of children who were being treated at the BCH. Dr. Hill delivered a presentation detailing information about HIV. He went into depth saying the outbreak was caused because the blood had been obtained from Americans who were on drugs or were otherwise diseased. It was never explained why this was allowed to happen. The meeting was directed at letting the parents and patients know that some people may be at risk of infection. They said if you want to know whether your child was infected, to ask.
Yeah.
This was the first time I'd ever heard of HIV or AIDS, so it was very worrying. They told us to look out for certain symptoms. So does that remain your memory of that meeting?
Yes, yeah.
Now, you told us in your statement that you recognised some of the symptoms, or thought you did. What can you tell us?
Well, they did mention to watch out if they came down with any illnesses, and Michael had glandular fever, and it worried me after, because they did mention that at the meeting, something about glandular fever. So on our next visit to the Children's Hospital, we had to go and see Sister Marion, and so I asked her then if Michael was all right, because it was worrying me, and she said, don't worry about Michael, he's fine. So after that, we just took it he was fine. And if I can go on,
Yes,
a year
please.
and a half, that's a rough guess. I think he was about 15 or something then. About a year and a half later, probably when he was in his late 16, we was given the bombshell that he was infected. And yet I thought, seeing he was all right then, going back, how come he was given it after that? Why wasn't they careful? Because if they say he's all right, then they should try and keep him all right. And yet he wasn't. And for a year and a half, we just thought it was fine, he was all right.
And you told us in your statement that this occasion when you were told the bombshell came about, you got a letter from Dr. Hill.
Yeah.
And you understood it was about Michael transferring to the adult haemophilia centre.
Yes.
And so you went to the meeting thinking that it was about that.
Yeah.
And at the end of the meeting, Dr. Hill, as you say in your statement, dropped the bombshell that Michael had HIV.
Yes. And there was only me and Michael in the room. My husband waited in the car because he thought it was just to do with moving hospitals, see. And well, it was. We both went silent. I wish now I'd have said more, but I just lost it, really. I just went. We both went quiet, you know. And I had to go and tell my husband. And we drove from. Nobody spoke. We was just silent.
And I think it follows from your evidence that you hadn't been told that Michael was being tested for HIV.
No. Well, I hadn't been told, but I suppose I must check them, but I don't know, it's complicated really, because I just thought he'd been obviously being tested to be told that he was all right. Don't worry about him, he's fine. So you just carry on then thinking he's all right. And for that whole year and a half, we just thought everything was fine. And yet they obviously were still giving him the treatment with the infected blood, you know, the infected treatment.
And if we go back to that medico-legal report we looked at a few moments ago, so WITN 1616003, and if we go to page 5, and I'm looking at this because we don't have Michael's records, but we have this report that you've exhibited to your statement that was based on Michael's records. And then the question at the top of the page is about on the date on which the first blood test carried out that produced an HIV positive result. And the answer's given, first sample 1984 retrospectively tested but report date not given. First fully dated result, 21st of February 1986, sampled. So I think that's the date the sample's taken, and then the report comes back 13th of March 86. Seroconversion occurred in or before 1984. And then question 10, on what date do the records show that the client was notified of his HIV positive condition? 24th of October 1986. So first of all, Linda, that reference there to October 1986, that's consistent with your recollection of it being a year and a half or more after that meeting at which you were told.
Right.
But this document suggests that testing at some point was carried out on a sample of Michael's blood from 1984, suggesting that he and that the result was positive as at 1984. Was that something you were ever told at the time?
No, I wasn't told.
We can take that down, thank you. When you were given this bombshell news, and in the weeks and months that followed, did you receive any support or advice from the hospital?
No. No, not concerning that, no.
Were you just
well, we moved to a different hospital then.
So you moved to the Queen
When
Elizabeth?
he dropped the bombshell, I never saw him again. We went to the Queen Elizabeth, and we was under, we was under Dr. Wilde for quite a while.
You say in your statement, reflecting on the way in which you were told about Michael's diagnosis, in the way in which you've described, that you felt and still feel as though you'd been lied to.
Well, I do, yeah. Well, for some time I thought, well, I was told he was all right. Was that a fib? I don't know. If it was, well, that was wrong, obviously. And then if it was the truth, then why did they carry on giving it him? And that was what's going in my mind all the while.
Michael was also infected with hepatitis C.
Yes.
But you learnt about that rather later. How did that come about?
Well, it was just after Michael had passed away, I had to go back to the back to the QE for some reason. I can't remember now, but I was on the car park just walking across, and one of the doctors that knew Michael, a lady doctor, I don't know her name, she saw me and come over to give her condolences and that, you know. And in the conversation, she just said, well, of course, he was hepatitis C positive as well. Well, I never knew. If I hadn't have met her on that car park, I wouldn't have known.
Can you tell us how Michael's health deteriorated as he got older?
Well, he used to have fatigue, lack of energy. He used to get bouts of diarrhea a lot, and occasional sickness. And he always used to say he ached as though he got the flu all the while, that sort of feeling all the while. And he gradually started to lose weight, you know, and wasn't eating like he used to. As he got nearer to when he was really, really poorly, he used to keep being sick. Diarrhea was bad. He just felt really ill all over. But he did have a lot of things before that. Certain things cropped up. He had pancreatitis, which I just presumed it was to do with the HIV. But thinking about it after, it could have been connected to the hepatitis C. But I didn't know he got it then, did I? So I just assumed it was to do with the HIV. And he had a bout of terrible headaches for oh, well over a year. They were so bad, he was on morphine tablets every day, quite high, to take these pains away. And then the one day, his head just swelled. It was twice the size of what it should have been. And he had to stay in hospital. And I think that they thought that he wasn't going to last very long, but he did get over that, actually. I don't know how, but he did. And that gradually went down. He had psoriasis in his scalp, you know, that's through stress and worry, you know. So he had a lot of things, really. The headaches, and then he did get meningitis at the end, passed with meningitis.
And what had been the effect on him, as a teenage boy, 16 years old, learning that he had this diagnosis? How did that impact upon him mentally?
Well, at first, you can tell it just knocked him for six, really, and that's when he had the psoriasis, not long after that. He went very quiet, and he never really told me exactly how he felt. He sort of kept it in, you know, but he said he didn't want anybody in the family to know at first, and he said he definitely didn't want his nan to know. They were very close, and she was she's nearly in her 80s, you know. So anyway, we did tell the close family in the end, and but he never told any friends, and that's the way he wanted to keep it. But the family were very good, and they kept it into the family, you know. But as time went on, he did seem to cope in his own way, and I'm very proud of him in that way, for how he coped.
Was he able to work?
He did have one job. He didn't really want to do it. He couldn't see the point. But he did go. He worked for in the council offices at Codsall. I think he only worked, I can't remember how long he was there. It could have been a year, I can't remember now. But then he left, and he got no interest. I mean, his ambition was to be a sports photographer because he loved taking photographs. And he couldn't play sport himself, but he loved his football. And he says, I'd love to have been a sports photographer. And he took some lovely photos. And of course, in those days, it was a proper camera with a film in, you see. And he did take nice, lovely photos of animals and things. But that was what he would have liked to have done. But I think in his mind, he thought, what's the point, you know?
And did he receive any treatment?
Sorry?
Did he receive treatment for HIV?
Yes, AZT.
And how was that?
Well, I don't know. He was really well when they... you see, I didn't go in the room with him that day. He went to see Dr. Hill, I think it was, yeah. He went in on his own, and he looked really well. He'd been on holiday, and he looked really well, and he hadn't lost any weight or nothing. And when he come out, he said, a blood test has showed that I need to go on treatment. There was some alteration in his blood, and I need to go on treatment. I've got to start on this tablet. Well, it was AZT, and that's all Michael told me. He'd got to go on this tablet, and he was on it for quite some time. But then he seemed to go downhill, you know.
You described in your statement the last few weeks of Michael's life. He'd come back to live with you, I think, and you were looking after him.
Yes.
And then he had to go into hospital. You've told us about that in your statement. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about it? It's entirely a matter for you as to whether you want to talk about it.
Well, He was living with his girlfriend. She knew all about everything, but I don't know, there was something that she just, the one day, she just told the social worker, and the social worker spoke to me, and she said that she didn't want to stay with him anymore, and she just, I was there, but I didn't know till she said, the girlfriend said, I've got to go to town, and she went out and left me alone with, Michael was in bed, and the social worker told me then that she didn't want to stay with him anymore, and I never saw her again after that, and we had to go and tell Michael, and he was really poorly in bed, and he got upset and started to cry. Anyway, we got him home. We had to get him home before she came back. So we got him home, and then I looked after him. That's when he went really downhill, you know. And I never saw her again, except for Michael asked me to go and get some money out. I don't think this is in his statement, but in the statement. But he said, "Mum, will you go to the bank and get me some money out?" And he gave me his card, and when I went, the account was empty. But that was the ones he used to pay his bills on, not one that he kept his main money in. And it was empty, and I come back and I said, there's nothing there. And he had to phone the bank. Well, he was friends with the bank. It was Midshire's Building Society, and he was good friends with the manageress. And anyway, she said the money was drawn out, so that upset him. Anyway, we went and got the card back off her, and so he was with me then, and he just come and give me a hug, and he says, "Mum, I'm glad to be back home with you." And I said, "Oh, well, I'm glad to have you back."
And then in the last month of Michael's life, he was in the Heartlands Hospital, and you remained there with him.
For a whole month, yeah. Yeah, I slept in the chair at the side of his bed. He'd got his own room and bathroom, you know. And I looked after him and washed his hair. He was mad on his hair being just right, you know. I just looked after him, yeah.
Michael died 1995, just before his 26th birthday.
Yeah.
You'd had to give up work, I think, yourself to look after him.
Yeah.
And after Michael died, your husband had to take a year's unpaid leave to look after you.
Yeah, his boss suggested it. He said, because Paul was worried about leaving me on my own, you know.
Michael was your only child.
Yeah.
And you said in your statement you feel you lost the chance to have grandchildren.
That's it. He said, that's what he said to me, yeah. He said, "You'll never be a grandmother." And I said, I just said, "Well, don't worry about it." I didn't know what to say to him, you know.
At any point, did you or your husband or Michael ever get offered counselling or psychological support?
He used to have a social worker that her name was Jill, and they were very, very close, and she helped him a lot. But she used to help him with different things, but I didn't really get too involved with that. I think all that happened before he came back to me, see, so I wasn't there when she came. But she kept in touch. When she left, she went on a world cruise, and she always sent him postcards of where she was stopping, you know. And she kept in touch with him.
And were you offered any kind of support by anybody?
No.
You said in your statement that you still think about Michael every day.
I do, yeah, every single day, yeah.
And you describe it in your statement as a black cloud.
Pardon?
You describe it in your statement as being a black cloud that's lived over you since that time.
Well, your life changes and nothing's the same anymore. And you can't just, I don't know, they're just there all the while. Well, not all the while, obviously. There's times when you're doing things and they're not there, but every day I do think of him, yeah.
We've got some photos. We'll just look at those. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we could have Linda's photos, please, Lawrence. How old was he here? How old was he here, do you think?
Sure. I think he was probably about 7 or something, I'm not sure. Because I never wrote it down. You don't think of these things sometimes.
Where was this?
That was on the beach at Borth, just outside Borth. And he loved the sunshine. And he hated the rain. And yet, just before he passed away, it was raining. And he said to me, he said, would you help me? Outside his room, there was a corridor with glass windows you could see outside. And he said, would you take me to see the rain? And this is what upsets me, because he knew he wasn't going to see it again. Sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry. Lawrence, are you okay? We've put up a picture that it shows Michael when he's thinner, losing weight, and I think he lost more weight still after this. You don't like looking at it, but you think it's important that people see the reality.
I bought that so people could see, yeah.
And then there's just a couple more photos of Michael as a young adult, which you exhibited to your statement. So it's 1616002, please, Lawrence. So we see a picture of him there, and then there's one other photo, I think, next page. And another there.
Yeah. So you can see the difference with where he'd lost weight.
Thank you, Linda. I'm just going to ask the three of you now just to reflect on a couple of themes emerging from the evidence that you've all given to us today. The first is the issue of trust, trusting in the doctors and assuming that if the treatment's being given, it's safe and it's the right treatment. I think that emerged in particular in your evidence, Brenda, but from what all three of you have said, is that right? You start with you, Linda. You trusted the doctors.
Well, you do, don't you? Your life's in their hands, aren't they, sort of thing, and you believe what they say, and you've got to trust in them. You've got no choice. And then it makes you think after, should you trust doctors? It's...
I, like Linda, took my eldest Richard from Wolverhampton, where he's referred back to from Liverpool to Birmingham, because it was the regional centre. Yeah. And I thought it was the place where he would receive the most expert care. And in those days, we didn't expect to be asked consent for everything, because that wasn't the custom and practice at the time. So it felt like it was auto-consenting. But it was a relationship of trust, and they had to trust us to do the right thing with the product, particularly on home treatment. But absolute trust was given with them without the most precious things we had in the world.
Brenda?
Yes, we did trust the doctors. I think we'd got a child with an ongoing condition. We put our faith in the doctors to do the best for our children, and we believed what they said. And we followed what they advised without question. And looking back, maybe we should have questioned more. But you didn't in those days. I think maybe people do more now. But in those days, I don't think people did question as much as they do. But,
And then the second theme I wanted to just briefly ask you about then is the issue of choice. From the evidence all three of you have given, it doesn't appear as though any of you were really given a choice of treatment for your children. No. You would take your child to the hospital and the treatment would be given.
yes.
You didn't get told what the different risk factors were and you weren't given a choice.
No, there's no choice.
Nothing like that at all.
I remember with the factor 8, you went up and it was what was available in the fridge on that day. That's what it seemed to be.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the professionals didn't have as much choice as they wanted either, because there was a constraint about the supply. And I can remember some conversations, I think it was probably around 1984, where NHS factor 8 was so much in demand everywhere that there wasn't enough for the children who might have been at the top of Dr. Hill's list to be only given factor 8 rather than commercial concentrates. But he didn't have enough to do that, so it was a sort of diagram which involved the professionals as well as us, but clearly the consequences were much more significant for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the last theme I just again wanted to bring out of your evidence is the issue of how the information was given to you that your sons had been infected with HIV. And we've heard from Elizabeth seeing the names on the refrigerator in the treatment room. We've heard from you, Brenda, that your son was told at a relatively young age and you were not. Mm-hmm. And then we've heard from you, Linda, that you and Michael were told, but told much later on and not even knowing that that was what the meeting was about. The way in which you were told this news, and it can never be good news, it can never be anything other than a terrible thing to hear, but do you have any reflections on the way in which you found out?
Well, I think maybe the parents, in the case of children, parents should have been told before the child so that we could be prepared to help our child accept and take on board that information. Whereas we didn't even know he'd been told, and we couldn't understand why he changed so much and lost interest in everything that he loved before because he thought he'd got no future. So I think, we weren't given any tools to help him cope with it, which, is really difficult. I think we had our suspicions that he was infected, but taking that decision to actually physically go and ask was a difficult thing to do. So maybe I did shy away from doing that until I saw it written down in his notes. But I think it could have been handled a lot differently,
Linda?
Well, I think when I was told it was done in a cold way, no emotion, or it was just like he was just reading it off a page, you know what I mean? No feelings about it. It's the way he was, I'm afraid, that doctor, But I was just annoyed with that gap, what I spoke of.
When you thought everything was all right.
Yeah, for a year and a half, we just kept thinking, he's all right, because they found out about it, that this virus was about in some of the treatments. We just presumed we were all right for all that time.
I mean, I just find it unbelievable the way they sent a letter out telling someone of the hepatitis infection to a teenager for a letter just to drop through the letterbox with no warning whatsoever. I think that was pretty disgusting, to be quite honest.
I think the difficulty was that the emotional and psychological impact of that information wasn't accounted for. And the thing that I find very difficult is that everybody who was working within the hospital would have known information about my son. that I didn't know. And then that undermines trust because you don't know what people are thinking to whom you're talking. And we used to have to interact with a lot of different health professionals depending who was on duty at the time we were taking the children in. And so it undermined trust generally, I think, which had knock-on consequences then when we're dealing with a much more difficult scenario.
Yeah, we used to take them to the dentist at the Children's Hospital, didn't we? So it's quite possible that the dental department knew more about our sons than we did, you know, and other agencies that you come up against as well.
Yeah, I think another annoying thing is that because Michael was a teenager and not known for a year and a half, he could have passed it on.
Could have passed it on to you or to
He could have passed
friends
it
and
on to
girlfriends.
me even. He could have passed it on to friends. You know, he did have a girlfriend then. He was just sort of leaving school. But fortunately they didn't do anything like But I mean, he could have passed it on because we wasn't told.
He was, I think you said he was 16. He was actually 17 when he was told. And he knew,
Yeah.
or that they knew, when
Yeah,
he
he
was 50.
didn't know till he was just 17.
Those years, during those years, did he have a girlfriend? He had one at 16, plainly. You just mentioned that.
He had a girlfriend when he was at school, finishing school. He had two girlfriends, but the second one we were talking about before. But the first one, I mean, everything was fine, but it might not have been. That's what I'm trying to say.
and the hospital wouldn't have known that everything was fine.
You know, it's like he should have been told whenever he was infected, but we don't know when he was infected.
I'm just going to check behind me to see whether the legal representatives for the witnesses have anything further. Before I ask each of the witnesses if they've anything to add, sir, do you have any questions?
No, I've asked the only one I had in mind when the opportunity arose just a moment ago.
I'm going to ask each of you then if there's just anything you want to add. Elizabeth?
Yes, I'd so like to thank you for the tenor with which you've conducted these inquiries, because I think it has helped me and my family a great deal to be looking in detail at some of the really difficult things that are way past in our history. And I would like to say to those in the Department of Health and elsewhere from the past that this would have been much more useful to me if it was 20 years ago. And part of the difficulty is in the distance of time is accessing records and so on, which may not be so easy to access now or may have been destroyed. And so I would like to see in any future changes that happen as a consequence of this inquiry that patients or their parents, for the time being, have access to all the medical records and are able to write in them, because I think some of the oversights and mistakes that were made could have been corrected at the time and therefore had less of a consequence. And I would like, when institutions decide that they wish to destroy records, that the family or the patient has the opportunity to be given those records to hold, even if the institution is not going to continue to hold them. Because I think for families that have long-standing conditions and maybe hereditary conditions, there may be quite a lot of learning available within those records that they do wish to keep. And then if there is a long delay to a subsequent inquiry, they would have access to those records. Thank you.
Thank you. Brenda, is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, I'd just like to say that coming here today was a big decision for me, because for 25 years I haven't spoken about this in any depth to anyone. Not even my daughter really knew the full facts, or our families really. My side of the family did, because there's haemophilia in my side of the family. And I had two cousins who also passed away due to the contaminated blood. So my mother was a big support to me. So to talk about it, I'm hoping to get it out will have been therapeutic for me, and it's given my daughter a greater understanding as well of what happened, because she was 8 years younger than Andrew, and we did try to shield her from a lot of what was happening, because I didn't want it to blight 2 lives. I wanted her to have her life and, you know, be successful and have a happy life. So, you know, finally, she's becoming, you know, knows a lot more about it. And I'm hoping it will have helped me to sort of put things to bed maybe a little bit. And maybe I can talk about it a bit more. But, I mean, my mother was, Andrew was her only grandchild for 8 years, and he was the light of her life. And she really suffered, and she died 6 months after Andrew died. I think, you know, it did have a big effect on her as well. So it's, you know, we can't change the past, but I'm hoping that some good will come out of all of this now. And like Elizabeth says, people in the future won't have the same mistakes made, that things can be handled differently.
Linda, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just hope that we get some answers at the end of the day after all this time, because it's took too long in the first place, you know. We just need some answers, and just we don't really know now what the answer is going to be, do we? Who's at fault, or why did it happen, you know? And I just feel very proud of my son, the way he handled it, you know, and I just miss him that much. I don't know what else to say. It's just ruins your life.
Yeah.
Ruins your life.
It does ruin your life. You never ever get over it. It's like a black cloud. It's always there in your mind, always. Never ever goes away.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sir?
Well, I would just like to say a few words. It is, you should know, it's been deeply impressive to me to sit here and to listen to you and the way you have, first of all, been here, despite, and you've said as much, Brenda, despite your misgivings, you, as it were, brought yourself to do it. And no one who has watched could fail, I think, to see that at times you have struggled with your own emotions, each of you, in your own way. And I'm glad that the inquiry has been a place where you could feel that you could express your emotions if you wanted to. And you have each attempted to be as constructive as you can be, despite everything that has happened. And in many ways, your testimony has been the best testament to your children. So thank you, each of you.
So we have two more witnesses, in fact, our anonymous
we'll
witnesses.
take a break
if we could
first,
take the
won't we?
break. And just as a reminder to those listening, there will be no live stream, Zoom, YouTube access to this afternoon's remaining evidence.
Yes, I shall make an order. I have made the order, but I shall read it out and describe it to you as I always do when we come back at 3 o'clock to hear our next two witnesses. But in the meantime, please just remember not to take photographs around this hearing room, just in case you happen to catch someone you shouldn't.